Trabasso, who is the Irving B. Harris Professor of Psychology at the University of Chicago. And actually, I first met Tom many, many years ago, briefly, at the very first meeting of the Society for Text and Discourse. And I'd never been to one of these meetings before, obviously, since it was the first one, but I didn't know this community at all. And I discovered there was this whole group of psychologists who worried about story understanding. And I thought this was just the coolest thing ever, and they brought a very different perspective to the field. And I also discovered then that Tom was one of the leaders in this area, working in discourse processing and narrative comprehension, and in particular understanding the causal relationships between sentences and events and actions and states in stories. So I'm very happy that he's here with us today. And I also wanted to share one thing that I learned with you today, which is that apparently, according to the web, if you believe what you find on the web, he is also an expert in cows. You will find on the web, you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
A quote in the Chicago Tribune by Tom Trabasso that says, "These cows really bridge the gap between all groups of people. Cows are not threatening, have a lot of meaning because of what they provide. It brought people together and gave them something to talk about."
Do you know the context of that?
I know the context.
Oh.
So apparently there was they had plastic cows all around
Yeah,
Chicago.
300 of them. And they're huge. They had them three different poses, one lying down, one eating, and then one sort of, looking up. And they gave them to artists to decorate. And they had sponsors, and they paid them substantially for doing these things. They had some very top people. And then they put them all over the city. And yeah, this was a copy. That was after, believe me. We're not the second city, we were the first city. Second to Zurich, because Zurich was where two businessmen from Chicago discovered these things. But it was the most talked about experienced thing. So the very last day when these cows were up and they were starting to take them away, we went out and saying, wait a minute, there's several we didn't see. We knew, because I was looking at a website, and I said, oh, these are interesting. So we went to like the last 3 or 4 that we hadn't seen. And they were just dismantling them. And this reporter was there, and he said, well, what do you think about this? And I said, well, it's a great thing. It brought people together. So that's the context. Now you can understand why I said what I said. Otherwise, it sounds pretty stupid.
So if you search the web, you find tremendous amounts of psychology information, and then there's one article on cows.
That's pretty funny.
Anyway,
I'll be careful about the future. I got quoted on Shank once, too, so I don't know if that's in there.
I didn't find it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, okay. I don't think I'll repeat that right now. Well, thank you very much for having me. And I've had some wonderful conversations, starting with breakfast this morning, and it's gone on for the whole day. And I've learned so much. And I will make a prediction that my visit here will change my future in my life, okay, in major ways. Okay. So that's a prediction. We'll see if that's true, but I have a feeling it's going to be. Because of the helpful suggestions and making me revitalize my interest in our language work. I was at the point where I was beginning to think I no longer had anything to say, but I think we have something that's going to make a difference in the future. Okay, now today, I'm starting out with a question about what makes information accessible during or after narrative comprehension. So the basic idea is while you're reading something, a fictional piece or a story and so on, what is it that makes some ideas more accessible to you than others? And I'm going to try to give an account for an answer to that question in terms of an account that involves 3 components, which I'll describe to you in a moment. Now, the first thing I'd like to do, oh, by the way, for those of you, if you want to, the connectionist model that I have, we actually have a website that you can actually go in and enter your own data, or you can use some existing stories that I have there. But what it enables you to do is just basically put a matrix in and get some connection strengths out. You can specify, if you're only interested in a few relationships, you can get a couple nodes, you can get that information as well. I use it all the time to analyze my data. It's very convenient. And the students working with me use it. So it's been a very nice way in which to do modeling. And my email address is there for some of you, but that's not so important. Okay. Now, A few years ago, I reviewed a book by Catherine Emmett on narrative comprehension. And Catherine is a linguist at the University of Edinburgh who described how she believed the reader understands a narrative. And I'm going to give you a summary of her book, which I borrowed from my review. Basically, her position is that the reader constructs a dynamic mental representation or representations of possible worlds that are based upon information in the text. And in this construction, characters act and interact with one another over time and in space. And the characters behave in ways that correspond to the reader's real-life experiences. That is, the characters have some kind of verisimilitude. And the reader's mental representations store and accumulate information about which characters are involved in action at a given point in time in a particular location. And this knowledge, when accessed, allows readers to interpret the current situation and to update stored representations. She went on to show how she could actually use this idea to resolve pronominal references without a pronoun search, which is rather interesting. In other words, if two people are making plans to be together at a certain location later, and then you're given location information, and then there's a pronominal reference made, you know probably if it's one male, one female, you know who it is. And so it's the reinstatement of earlier information that enables you to do that. But the aspect that I'm going to seize on is the dynamic representation. And the model that I'm working with attempts to do that. That is the updating of knowledge as you progress through a story and how that makes things accessible or not. So, so the question is, how does a reader's understanding of a narrative affect accessibility of information both during and after reading? And the during and after refers to the fact that a lot of work has been done on so-called online processing in text and especially in narratives. And the accessibility is why are some things more available than others? And I want to account for that. So my goal is then to provide an account of readers' construction of a dynamic mental representation, a possible world based upon information in text. And the models you'll see are really text-based. That is, they're focusing on relationships amongst information in the text, although it assumes much more than that. And I'm going to adopt what we have called the three-pronged approach. Magliano and Gracer argued for this in 1991. That is, there are three parts, and the first one is there we go, I could do this, discourse analysis, which you do on your materials, and this is often not done in psychology. People very often make what I call hand-waving claims about a text, and they're based upon intuition. And I'm going to show that's a very dangerous practice. And then I have a connection to this process model. They were arguing for any kind of process model. And then the third part is to predict behavioral data. So those are the three components: discourse analysis, some kind of theory, process model, and then the data against which you validate that.
Excuse me, this claim that that's how humans do it. Is that right?
I'm sorry?
It is claimed that that's how humans do it. Do I understand?
I'm going to make a lot of claims that people will do a lot of the things that are in this connection. That'll do things people will do things that I do in the discourse analysis. People will do things that are done in the process model, and the validation of those will be against actual data on humans. Okay. Now, which parts of this is really crucial, I can't really tell you. Okay. You have to look at the successor that I have in doing this. You are updating, okay, I'm an entity, right? You're creating a representation of me in your memory. And as I'm giving you information, you're adding to it, right? So you could actually, if I asked you something about my background, you might say, well, you had this interview in the Chicago Tribune about cows in Chicago. And then you told us about the background of that interview and so on, right? You may have some memory of that. Well, where's it coming from? This was what you're constructing this entity around which you're building this representation. I'm going to focus on a particular kind of representation of the information in narrative. So it is psychological. It is an attempt to simulate what people do. Clearly, I'm doing much more and things different than people do, but there's a lot of things in common. And I'll try to point out what I think those are. It's a good question. All right, so the connectionist model I'm using is actually a very simplified version of the one that Kinch uses. It's a difference is that my inputs are different than his, and I'm not going to be working with a working memory. It turns out that it doesn't really matter. So we have, basically when I get to it, I'll explain to you that the amount of activation that a particular node receives is proportional in some sense to its connection strength at the time. So the rich get richer in this model. Okay, so discourse analysis is basically a construction of a representation of a narrative situation, and I'm going to apply a causal analysis, which I've published and used extensively in a large number of stories. And I'll get to that in a moment. The connectionist model, we have a chapter which I'll probably send here for some people who might be interested, in which we applied the model to about, I don't know, 31 different studies, maybe 6 or 7 different laboratories. And I did a simulation of a large number of findings across a wide range of literature. So but basically what the model does, it integrates clauses one at a time. So we're going to feed in a clause one at a time along with connections, and it's going to quantify the results. In other words, what I'm interested in is trying to use this connectionist model as a means of getting measures on the degree of availability. And I'm going to use connection strength here. And there's 2 kinds that we're going to be concerned with. Connection strengths of individual nodes. In other words, if you have a matrix, an n by n matrix, and I just sum down one column and then take the average of that, I get connection strength, say, for that one node. That would be a way in which you might access information where you have multiple inputs. In other words, many, many sources, and it's not, we don't particularly know which one, but the availability of that depends upon its overall connection strength. If I'm doing things online, and in that case, we're going to be interested in, let's say you're about to read a given clause, or you just read one clause, and now you're going to read a second clause. Then the relationship between the clause you just read and the one that's coming up, that can be affected, the processing of that can be affected by the connection strength between the two of them. Okay? Or it might be that you read a clause and then there's some information from a previous clause that you're being primed for. In other words, I'm just going to give you one word or so, and that one word is from that clause. Then we'll use this internodal or between node connection strength to make that prediction. So there's 2 measures that come out of the model that are useful, and it depends upon the application as to which measure we use. And I will point those out as we go along. Okay. Now I'm going to present 3 cases. I'm going to go over 3 experiments, mainly to give you the variety, and these have gotten some interest in their own, but there's a couple other points. One is on common ground. But this is a study by Green, McCoon, Ratcliffe, and Garrick, I guess, and Lee Brooks and some of his students. The idea on common ground is that if you and I are having a conversation and we establish common ground, people will assume that we have some kind of common knowledge, and then if one person's saying something, I can make an inference the other person knows it. There's been a lot of work like that in psychological literature. And they use this term common ground to explain things when I think it's really a descriptive term. Anyway, that's one phenomenon. And I'll go into a little more detail about the materials here. Basically, the idea is that something shared early on between characters is then used to prime something later on. It has to be available. Spatial distance, this is from Rink and Bauer. Gordon Bauer and Morrow have done a lot of work on having people study maps and then hear stories. And the spatial information then is somehow or other used to understand the stories. And their argument is that people make a spatial model of what's going on and then use the distances in the space in order to predict various kinds of data. I'm going to show that actually what they do with the spatial information is to integrate it into a story representation and use that to access spatial information. And then there's a quite famous, in social psychology, a quite famous area established by Kahneman and Tversky in 1982 on counterfactual reasoning, and there's a story that they use, and the story has certain kinds of problems with it, but were only revealed when I did the discourse analysis, and then I actually did some experiments later on to improve on it. But I'm going to give account for their data as well. Each of these three cases have very different theories, and what I'm going to show is that in most cases, first of all, there's a common theory that's in some sense simpler that accounts for all three cases. And there's also problems of interpretation with all three of them that I'll point out. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but that is an issue here. And the reason that they have the problems they have is because they don't do discourse analysis. They didn't pay much attention to the materials they were working with. Okay, now where to go next? I'm trying to decide. What I think I'll do is I'll give you an outline of the approach, and then we'll worry about other things you may want to know. Because there's a lot of things I have to skip in order to get through this thing, and I don't want to shortchange you, but whoops, they got it right? Yeah, okay. I thought it was backwards for a minute. All right, so we start with the text here, and then we do our discourse analysis. And here the discourse analysis is really a technique for parsing and analyzing the clauses in a narrative, sometimes sentences, usually when they're simple, and looking for relationships amongst the clauses, in which case we produce a network. And this network is going to be, these things are going to be linked by causal inferences that tie them together, and I'll go over some of the details of that. We then take that network and we put it into the connectionist model one node at a time, and the model generates a matrix at each step. And so then we have, put in the second node with connections and the third node and so forth as we go through. And what it enables us to do, and this is, for some reason, a lot of people could have done this in psychology but haven't done it with the models that existed, it enables you to get online data as well as offline. That is, as you're going through, for example, like here you could say, what's the relationship between 1 and 3? And then down here, what's the relationship between 1 and 3? Okay, and those things are going to change. And one of the things I found out from using this connectionist model is that my own intuitions are very often wrong, that I really need to simulate to find out what's happening. There are a lot of phenomena that you just don't know. For example, like if I explain one of these nodes later on, give a lot of explanation down here, what's it do to that particular node, and what's it do to the ones that are attached to it? So there's both indirect and direct effects. And you don't know what they are until you actually run the simulations. So what we're going to get are connection strengths over here that are being output in these matrices. We'll have matrices of connection strengths. We have to have criteria for what measure do we use. And then here we're going to compare the measures against data. Okay? So that's the approach. Now, here's my decision. I'm not going to be able to go into details of this. I could spend a lot of time on what constitutes a discourse analysis. I could spend some time on the properties of the model and what we assume. I could spend, I am going to spend some time here. What I'm going to do is give you a case. I'm going to derive or show you, I'm going to show you what the story was. I'm going to show you the matrix, and there I'll explain a lot more about the causal stuff. And then I'll go over to this level here of comparison. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the model. This is a very simple connectionist model. It just basically updates in terms of connections. The strengths change as a function of being connected, and the activation depends upon the connection strength. I'll just show you the equations for it. So I know this is an engineering group, right? So anyway, these are the key equations in the model. So the activation depends upon the connection strength at the time and the previous activation level. And then when you're computing the connection strengths, it's going to be the connection strength at time t. And then it's going to be whoops, did I make some mistake here? Oh, yeah. The whatever connection strength it was between I and j, then it's going to be incremented by some product of the activation levels. And the activations are normalized, okay, after each iteration. Yeah.
I'm just a little confused about what the discourse analysis is.
I'm going to spend time on that. Okay, I'll go through an example and make it clearer. Yeah, and I'm trying to get past this sort of initial overview, but I will definitely answer your question when we get to a story, okay? Okay. And sometimes I get questions on this. I'll just present it so people know. For those of you who are interested in connection and modeling, basically all direct connections begin with equal strengths. It's bidirectional, so it doesn't matter which is the cause and the effect as long as there's a connection there. Initial activation starts with 1, but that's going to change as a function of how many nodes are there. Everything participates in the processing. This is unusual with respect to some models that have working memories. We don't have one. Yeah.
Mr. Bidirectional means that the strength, the connection weights in both directions are equal?
It doesn't, in other words, it's bidirectional in the sense that the cause doesn't get any more weight than the effect and the effect more than the cause, okay? And there's evidence to actually support that people can go in both directions if they make that inference. That's what it means. So the node is always the same node, okay? So the cause could be J and the antecedent could be, the consequent.
So Wij and Wj are the same?
Yeah, right. Did I have that? Was there something in my?
No.
Oh, okay. Yeah, they're the same. And then we had settling rules and so on, and activation values carried across. Okay, so and the connection strengths. I'm not sure this is quite right because they actually can go up and then down, but there's a minimum they can go to. Okay. So anyway, let me take the first case and I'll get to your question about the model so you get a sense of what I'm trying to do. Now, so this is an experiment by Green, Garrick, McCune, and Ratcliffe. It was published in '94 in the Journal of Memory and Language. And they had this assumption that common ground is shared by characters, and this knowledge is then used to access reference of what they called unheralded pronouns, where the immediate context has no explicit antecedent for the referent. Okay? And they claim, this is their theory, the accessibility of characters in a story wanes and waxes as other characters who share knowledge of those characters part and reunite. So, the other claim here is that the speakers and addressees make knowledge that they hold in common relatively more accessible than other knowledge. All right, okay, so the story that they had, the characters were talking about a third person, a cousin in one story. I analyzed 3 stories, a mugger or a ranger, and they established common ground. And in the second episode, there were 2 different versions. And when they called concept present, the referent is maintained by repeated mentions, and the concept absent, the referent is not mentioned. And then there's a third episode. Where the original pair of characters are reunited and refer to the target individual with an unheralded pronoun. In other words, they say she in the absence of anything else. The data show the referent is less available in the second episode of the absent version. This is where where the character is not maintained, the common ground character is not maintained, but is more available after the character's reunion and use of the unheralded pronoun. In other words, the characters come back together, then you assume they have this common knowledge that's supposed to be activated and used. Okay, so let me show you the story. Okay, so you have the story about Jane, who's going to have dinner with her cousin Marilyn. She complains to her roommate Gloria. So those are the 2 characters that are establishing common ground. Every time I go to dinner with my cousins, I get sick. Gloria asks, well, why do you go? Why do you agree to go? Because I am too wimpy to say no. And Jane went off to have dinner. Okay? Now, in terms of discourse analysis, let me ask you a question. Okay? Why do you think Jane went off to dinner?
She went off to dinner?
Yeah, why did she go off to dinner?
I would say she, I would expect the pronoun. She went.
Well, this is, they used, this is the way it's written, but why did Jane go off to dinner? In this story, why did she go off to dinner?
It would be a say no.
That's one reason. Why else?
Well, she was invited.
Yeah, she's going to have dinner with her cousin, right? That's there, right? So there are at least 2 reasons why. Okay? So in my discourse analysis, I do much more than this, but basically I'll be looking for relationships between every clause and every other clause, but I'm looking for a direct relationship. So there might be a direct relationship between the fact that she's going to have dinner with her cousin, which is established here, and that she's too wimpy to say no. Okay? There's two reasons why she would be going. Okay? That's a little bit of a feeling for it. It doesn't do the whole thing, but it gives you an idea. But she has a goal to have dinner with her cousin, and that goal will motivate this action of going off to dinner. Now, so that's the first episode. In the second episode, when she arrived, that's Jane. Okay, Marilyn, her cousin, was just finishing the cooking. You're in luck, she said, we're having a fried squid. Jane knew that she was in for a wonderful evening. That's probably said with a different intonation I'm using. The two of them sat down to dinner. After dinner, they talked for a while, and then Jane left. All right. That's one. And then the other one, it focuses on Gloria. Goes back to the other character. So the cousin's not being maintained. Gloria decided to cook something nice for herself for dinner. As long as I'm home alone, she thought, I'll eat well. She searches her refrigerator for ingredients. She finds enough eggs to make a quiche. After dinner, she put the dishes in the dishwasher. So that's the intervening thing. So there's two different versions. And then we have the third episode, which involves three different sentences. There's a reunion sentence. Gloria was still up when Jane arrived, so they got people coming back together. And one of the questions is how available is the information for the cousin at this point in time?
For the cousin.
Yeah, for the cousin. So they would present the word cousin, okay? They would present the word cousin.
How do we know what the cousin is?
Right, they would present the word cousin and then look at the speed with which you recognize that word, say, okay? And then there's another sentence here, the pronoun sentence. Gloria asked Jane, did she play you old disco records? So this is where the unheralded pronoun comes in, and then they would put maybe cousin in here, another group of subjects. And then the final sentence where Jane chuckled and said, I can't get disco out of my mind, and then they present cousin again. So what they're doing is presenting the key word from the first episode in both versions, and the question is the speed with which this happens. And their argument is that when there's common ground, before the reunion, there would be more maintenance of the cousin because in the one version, because the cousin's being mentioned and so forth. But the other, in the absent version, it would not be as available. After the reunion, they expected that both of them that it would be equally available because of bringing together the characters who are associated with the cousin, so-called common ground. And then after the pronoun itself, there would be no difference between the groups because the pronoun would have been resolved by that time. Okay, so now, in order to satisfy
I'm not following this. For whom is this available? For the reader?
the reader reads one version.
Yes.
And their claim was that when they were discussing the cousin, okay, and there was a common ground there, and it was maintained, then the cousin should be available for two reasons: the discussion about her and the maintenance.
But when you say available, you mean we are aware of the fact that she cooks badly?
You know and you also know who she is. If
Yeah, she is the cousin.
That's right.
And you know stuff about it.
right, and you would be, and as soon as when they get back together, you would activate some memory of the cousin and so forth in both versions. Okay, so
What is that? The word cousin on the computer?
yeah, there's another task. Or people are told they do this word recognition all the way through. So it's a speed with which they can identify a word. So it's a priming study.
So a word gets flashed and you press a button or something?
Right, exactly. So there are a number of words that are being presented between the sentences that they have to respond to. And they look at the speed with which that's done, and that's called priming. So if the cousin is very available, the amount of time it takes to identify it is going to be faster. That's the key thing. Good.
And when you say identify, what are the instructions that if you can associate this word with the story or something, say push the button?
No. It's not that. It could be, I'm not sure now whether it was just word identification or whether it was in the story or not. Could have been either one. I don't remember the details now. Okay, my guess is it's word identification.
Excuse me, in comes the sentence with the she in it.
Yeah, and then after that,
There is some thing which...
There's always like a little X's on the screen, and then right next, those little X's, the word will appear. And your job is to both understand the story and
And see...
and identify these words.
But identify means that you concentrate on them, or your eye goes
You
there.
just say it.
Huh?
Or you either say it or...
Yeah, it could be just naming. It could be how fast you can name it. Yeah,
Right.
there are different ways in which.
So the word
Thanks.
pops up and you say cousin, and you're faster in some cases than you are in other cases. And
Right.
it's going to depend on the...
And there are other
So-
choices.
Yeah.
No, not
No, no,
at,
no.
not at that time. But it's
The other choice, it's done across subjects, I take it, right, Tom?
that's correct.
So there's
So-
only the
so
word
one
cousin
group of
shows up, and I
right.
say it. And sometimes I say it faster. It's not
Right.
that I selected for all.
Right.
You're-
But as he said, there are other words that you're also supposed to say that are appearing during the
Apple
story
might
too.
show up
But the
somewhere.
critical word here is cousin.
Yeah, and there are control words that are not, say, not in the story. Okay, and so compared to controls, you're faster or slower, or the same. Okay, again, not going into the details of the discourse analysis. But this would be the network that I would derive. And so there would be relationships between, can I get this thing to work? No, it's not working. Oh, there it is. What?
Technology is never ending.
No, it's not working. I don't know what the problem is. I can't get it to work.
Is the right
A stick is better. Anyway, we got to look at the first and third. There was in other words, number 3 was the reason for number 1. In other words, why was she dreading going to her cousin? And the reason is given in the story where she doesn't like eating the kind of food she cooks. Okay, so that's one sense of it. Now, when I do this analysis, in order to be complete, what I do is I categorize every single clause according to an episodic structure that it falls into. So is it a goal? Is it an attempt to achieve a goal? Is it an outcome of an attempt? Is it an internal reaction of some kind of the character to something? Is it an event that's happening to the character, and so on? So basically, you have an episodic structure analysis. Okay.
And that's all automated.
No, that's not automated. But it's in the process of being automated. Yes, that's what we had a lot of nice discussions about today. But that's quite reliable, and you can train people to do it. And there's certain cues you have to be able to do it. And it's also, as you go through a temporal sequence, and these are pretty much laid out in temporal order, except 3 was antecedent to 1 in time. It makes it easier. But once you have the categories, then it's a little easier to identify causal relationships. So, for example, the reason she doesn't want to go is that's a goal. It's being motivated by the fact that she had a bad experience with a cousin's food before. Okay? So that would be for us an initiating event in the past that led to her setting up a goal to avoid an aversive state. And then I think this number 6 is where she probably leaves somewhere. Yeah, this is where she's leaving to go. And that's motivated by the goal of going there. And it's also because she's wimpy. Okay, so that's in there as well. All right, so, but the key test that we do, once we go, we do 2 different levels of analysis. One is the categorization that helps us what to look for in terms of relationships. But and then we ask why questions. There's lots of ways in which you can do this. So I often use why question analysis as well as the categories. And then once I think there's a relationship, and it's a direct one, then I test it counterfactually. In other words, if she wasn't so wimpy, she might not have gone. Okay, so if I negate the antecedent, do I also negate the consequent in this story? And this is called a counterfactual test. And it's, what it tests is the necessity of that particular condition in the story for something we think is related to it. Okay? And that's our way in which we achieve high reliability, by testing ourselves over and over again about these counterfactuals. So every single pair of nodes in here which are connected by an arrow were tested counterfactually. So basically what it is, it's a theory about causation that says this is a set of circumstances. The story is a set of circumstances. The narrator puts into it conditions, okay, which are individually necessary for other things to occur, but they're jointly sufficient. In other words, any one statement is necessary but not sufficient. But you have to assume that a whole set of circumstances occurring here to make it sufficient. So we have what we call a strong necessity, which is governed by this counterfactual test, and weak sufficiency. Now, sufficiency means, and I'm borrowing heavily from Mackey, who was a philosopher who wrote on causation and published a book in 1980 called Causation, the Cement of the Universe, modest title. So I used his arguments to justify this. So strong necessity is this counterfactual. Weak sufficiency is if you have a story, a set of circumstances, you put a condition into it, and you let the story go on from there, something will happen. Okay? So the fact that she leaves here, for example, but comes back down here, okay? In other words, her leaving in this story sets up conditions where it's likely she's going to return. All right? So having that in the story is weakly sufficient for this to happen later on. It's also counterfactually true that if she didn't leave, she wouldn't be coming back. Okay. I hope that gives you a little more feeling. It doesn't do justice to this analysis, which took me many, many years to develop.
So it's just, you're just focusing on particular kinds of narratives, right? So
Well, in this particular talk, I'm focusing on materials used by experimenters to study narratives. Okay. However, this analysis, which I'm presenting, is successful on folktales. I analyzed 6 Chinese folktales of 270-something clauses. The model works very well on that, the analysis. We've analyzed several thousand personal narratives of people talking about trauma, about death, and so on. I've analyzed a lot of folktales besides these Chinese ones that were used as experimental materials and so on. I've used the model to construct stories and then analyze them. All right? So it has a lot of usage and it's well established. And we get pretty high reliability when we do this. We get agreements in the 90% range. So that's well established. Okay. So let me just, what I did is I took those matrices I just showed you, or those networks, and I put them into matrices and fed them into the computer. And here's what we get. Now there's 2 sets of studies here, so let me go over it. So here's the connection strength. It's a difference between the 2 versions. So I'm taking the one version where where this cousin is present all the way through, okay? And I didn't point out to you, maybe I should. It's not only that the cousin is present all the way through, it's also that there's more causal connections there. That is, there's more coherence in that story. Whereas when you jump to from one character to the other, there's less coherence, there are fewer connections, and that's why you get this difference in connection strength that I get. So this is the difference in connection strength between the 2 versions. So if there's the more connection strength, okay, so recognition, the absent, okay, I'm taking the one where the cousin is absent versus the one where the cousin is present all the way through. So this is the amount of priming, and you get the greater the connection strength difference between the 2 stories. That means it's more available in one version than the other, the greater the amount of priming. So the degree of priming, the speed with which you recognize something, depends upon the measure of availability that I have here. Okay? And Brooke Lee, the average green is 3 stories that I analyzed from that particular study. And then I took the same 3 stories and I looked at Brooke Lee's data, which is a replication of their study without common ground. He just basically took out common ground but kept the same stories. And it turns out you get very similar kinds of predictions. So I was able to predict his data as well. So that's a correlation then between speed of recognition, amount of priming, and connection strength.
Excuse me, the word common ground, the expression common ground refers to the common ground between the 2 characters.
Between the 2 characters, which is established in their conversation. Right. It's not, that's their operational. And when they come back together, whatever they had in common. Now, this
Common means the knowledge that they have.
common knowledge, but Boaz Kazar criticized this study saying, well, it could be associated, and I agree with him. It is associated, but what my analysis is showing is that there's a difference in the stories in terms of the structure, that the so-called present structure, there's many more connections, it's more coherent. So what that's doing is maintaining and keeping the strength of the initial sentences with respect to the cousin. Okay? So those sentences which contain cousin are much more available. There are more of them and they're more available than those sentences which do not, than in that version where there's only one or two sentences. Okay? So that's the difference. In other words, I can give an alternative account in terms of accessibility based upon integration of that information into this updating model. Okay, so, which probably is my conclusions here anyway. Yeah, so what this model analysis and simulation shows is that the availability of a referent is a result of comprehending and integrating content conditions through their meaning relationships, that is, through these inferences, into a dynamic representation. And there's an alternative explanation, the common ground. That is, it's not just the mutual knowledge they have, but it's also how that cousin is talked about and in what ways and what other sentences she occurs and whether those are linked. And Kazar, as I said, made this criticism about common ground as not being parsimonious, that there could be association with the cousin that makes it accessible, and I agree, but the associations are established between these meaning relationships between things, not just because it co-occurs with the characters themselves. So that's that claim. Okay, now I want to turn to the second case. And this is on spatial distance and the situation model. The situation model, yeah.
I just had a quick question about the result you just drew.
Sure.
So there was a performance difference between,
Those two studies.
yeah. So, I mean, were you saying that there's no effect of common ground whatsoever?
No. Those are the same story. In other words, the ones I showed by Brookley, those stories had common ground in it. So it's the same stories. It's a replication. It's just a replication of the same study. Now, the fact that the times are faster could be subject differences. I don't really know. The main thing is that there was a correlation between connection strengths and speed of processing. Okay? Yeah. I didn't make it that clear. It's really a replication. In the second, I had another slide I was going to show you, but basically, if you look at the difference between when you remove common ground, then you get the same results when it's in there. So, okay, if you take the same story and just they don't talk about the cousin that way, or they don't share it, but she thinks about the cousin to herself, so it's not common ground, it's only inside her head, then you get the same result. So it doesn't depend upon common ground. That's the argument. Yeah, and that's an example where they didn't do a discourse analysis. They didn't expect them to. Okay, I'll just go over this thing here. I can do it off a diagram. It's easier. In this study, people study this diagram, and they take tests on it. They get good at identifying rooms and what's in it and all that stuff. So it's a laboratory of some hypothetical place, and this is the building layout that people memorize. And so, for example, hey, it's working. In the experiment room, there's objects like a blackboard and a clock and speakers or booths, and there may be some, so characters move, say, from, okay, let's say they move from the repair shop through the washroom into the storage room, okay? And so the people have memorized this is in memory. Okay, something about this is in memory. And their argument was that people are using this spatial knowledge then to go from one room to another, and there would be spatial distance. In other words, if I'm in this room here, in the storage room, and I have a reference to something about tools, okay, that's going to be less accessible than information about lockers, and it's going to be, but the tools will be more accessible than information about the magazine rack in this room here. If the character had gone through that distance. And their argument was that in order to retrieve this, you had to, in your mental model, you had to simulate walking back through space to get from one location to the other. And they have many, many experiments to demonstrate this, but in all the studies, they have people memorize this diagram, commit it to memory, they answer questions on it, and then they tell a story. And the story that I analyzed was, and I've actually analyzed several others by them now, but the one that I analyzed for purpose of this talk was about a laboratory supervisor. There was a committee coming to review the laboratory, and he's very worried about the reception for them. And he's going through making sure everything is in order. So he goes into the experiment room, and he finds material on the floor, and he has to make a mental note that he's got to tell so-and-so to make sure that's cleaned up. And he goes into the lounge, and the television is on, so he turns it off. And then he goes into the repair shop, and there are tools on the floor, and there's the tool cabinet, and so on. So in each sentence, there's some mention of the room he's walking into and what objects are there. And he continues on through. And then at various points, there's probes. In other words, the person, say, they're probing something. He's in this room right here. He just read about that. And as I said, they might present something like the magazine rack, or they might say something about the magazine rack is in the reception room, okay? And the speed with which you can say true or false about that would be recorded. And so they're looking at spatial distance from this, what they call the goal room, back to some other rooms. And they had like 3 points back in time and space. So I'll just show you the representation of one part of this, and it'll illustrate, again, the discourse analysis. All right, so in sentence number 3, there was the event about the director's visit, okay? I don't know why this doesn't work. Okay. About the director's visit here. And then in sentence 13, he sets up a goal to get the building cleaned up. He has a meeting with his workers and explains to them, these guys are coming, we better get this place cleaned up. And then he goes out inspecting all the rooms and finds problems in each room that he has to then take care of or get people to do. But in each case, these objects are not mentioned. They're to be inferred, but since people studied these rooms, I assume that this space here enables this object to be there. So I basically made it a kind of setting statement in my analysis. So there is an association being captured here between the room and the object. Starting to give out here. This has been a long day. So they did 2 kinds of probes. They did probes where they present only the object, or they present the room and the object together. Okay, and these probes could occur almost anywhere. They could occur close to the space here, but most of the ones they report are always occur after the goal room. So it's right after they read this thing, and we put the sentence in here, it primes. It's something about something that's happening when he's in the goal room, and then they present the target and look at the speed with which you can process it. And the distance would be then, this is the closest one, this is the one next closest, this would be a little further away, and this one's very distant. Okay, so that's what data are going to be. And their argument was it was a spatial distance argument, and my argument is that there's going to be differences in connection strength, which are going to be related to probably causal distance. That is, what's the shortest path you could find from one location to the other in the network. And I didn't show you the full network, but here's what comes out. So when we grind through in terms of connection strength, these are the connection strengths here. Now this is the connection strength between the priming sentence and the target sentence. So it could be sentence number 32 and sentence number 6. Okay, that's a really far distance. And what you find is that there's a nice distance effect here, but it's also related to connection strength. So that the goal information is much more available at this point in time, and this other room is the least available, and you get a nice function there. So I can simulate these data indexing everything in terms of connection strength, and it's related to causal distance than it is to spatial distance. So the argument is that you don't need a spatial model necessary to account for this data. I'll also show you another effect that they found. Now, the relationships here may not be so obvious to you, but let me show you what's going on. Here you got two primes. You got the room and the object name together. That's going to be faster overall than when you present the object alone. In other words, the object less available. But when you present the room and object, it's more available. Those are the actual data in terms of these 4 locations. And I produce the same effect here. That is, the object and the room, the connection strength is greater all the way through than the connection strength of the object itself. Okay? So that the objects are less available. The rooms are the first thing you think of. The next thing you think of is the objects in it. And that shows up in terms of a difference in connection strength. So I was able to produce another phenomenon they reported. Okay, so what this suggests then for the second case is that what people are doing is they're creating a narrative representation and they're incorporating spatial knowledge into it. In other words, things they already know about this space are being integrated into, they're being used to understand where the character is in space and time, but they're also being integrated into the overall representation. So I could take one representation of narrative and reproduce their spatial data. Now, I've actually applied this model to about 7 experiments that Rink and Bauer have done, all kinds of variations, but I keep on reproducing the same spatial distance effect. So I'm convinced that in that experiment, it's not just spatial, it's probably something to do with the integration that takes place and how available something is as a result. Okay, let me go to a third case, which is the counterfactual thinking. Kahneman and Tversky did a seminal chapter on this, which then went into social psychology and became fairly actively studied by a number of people. But the argument about counterfactual is that when bad things happen to good people, you try to undo the bad things. Okay, that's basically what happens. So what you want to do is alter some factual antecedent and sort of assess the consequences of it. In other words, you miss an airplane by 30 seconds because you got delayed at a traffic light. So you say, oh, if I hadn't been delayed at a traffic light, I could have made it. The funny example they give is this one here, which I think is kind of funny. Madame Bovary marries dull Henry Bovary. As a result, Madame Bovary is unhappy and commits suicide. So if she hadn't married dull Henry, she wouldn't have committed suicide. Now,
what is the point of this? I'm sorry.
well, they're interested in social psychology. Okay, they're interested in regret phenomena. So when something bad happens, and the argument is that you always go back and review the antecedents, and you think about undoing them in some way. And they call this a simulation heuristic. In other words, you're undoing something and saying, oh, well, if she hadn't married this guy, she would be alive today, right? And they're not very clear about the motivation for this. There is evidence that counterfactual reasoning occurs in natural situations with disasters. People often express this kind of regret and go back and do it. So it seems to be a real phenomenon. Now, they were interested in studying it experimentally. All right?
But this sentence here,
This modem Bovary?
presumably Madame Bovary mind or somebody?
Oh, maybe it's something you know, and if you really cared about her, you might worry. You might go.
I mean, you know that she'd marry another dull guy, right?
All kinds
so
of.
Nobody.
I don't think it's
I
I don't think it's a great example. Yeah, I don't think it's a great example. I had a longer one that takes a little more time to give you, but the example would be, the ones that they appeal to your intuitions on are things like going to the airport and just missing a plane by a few minutes, and then going back and reviewing why you missed it and picking out some cause and undoing it. That's what they're concerned with. But it's also the case that the counterfactual is used to do any they could be just looking at causes here. You're not necessarily engaged in counterfactual reasoning unless you want to test it. Yeah, and as you say, you thought of other alternatives, but they're in the constraints of that situation where she did die, right? You could hold him responsible. Okay. So I'm not going to go into all that detail, but okay, so they had this simulation heuristic that they argued for, and it became another explanation in literature. So it's mental undoing of some past events in order to achieve a desired state. And they argue that people are more likely to undo abnormal or unlikely past events, ones that deviate from normality, in order to achieve a desired state. And I'm going to give you an example of that in a minute. And the idea was that if you're dealing with something abnormal, it's easier in their view to go back to the normal than it is to go from the norm to the abnormal. And again, I'll explain how they interpreted that in terms of their story, but I find it a very strange explanation for a lot of reasons. So, and my argument was that basically what people are doing is looking for causes. If you give them something that's happened that's bad and you're providing an explanation, you'll examine the explanation, regardless of whether it's unusual or not. So, let me go into the story itself and give you a sense of it. Okay.
All these stories are constructed.
These are all, these are experimenters making up stories, and there's been a lot of criticism of this field with respect to the artificiality of the stories, so we don't have to go into that, but it is a problem. And the criticism that I'm making here is not only the artificiality of it, but the kinds of things that they do that confound your interpretation of what's going on, okay? And so in this story, the basic story was there was this guy who was 47 years old, and he has children, and he's a banking and so forth, and then they have different versions here. And then they have this description of the accident. The accident occurs at an intersection. He approaches it, and he braked, stopped at the crossing, although he could have gone through. And then it's a common occurrence. He does that a lot. He begins to cross, and then he gets killed, and so on. Okay, so that's the basic story. And this is called the Mr. Jones story, and there are thousands of references to it in this literature. But let me show you what they inserted. I don't have the right. Yeah, this is the full story. Let me show you what they inserted here. So, and then again, for your benefit, here are all the classifications of all the clauses, and then I'm going to find relationships amongst them.
This is the discourse analysis.
This is part of it. This is where I went through and I classified all the categories. And then let me show you. This is the route version. Okay, so in this one here, the key thing is that he leaves early, which is unusual, okay? But they discount it. What they do is they say, he leaves on time, left the office at the regular time. That's one thing. So time is one factor. And another factor is the route. He goes home he doesn't go home by his regular route. That's what's abnormal. And what they're interested in is the normal versus abnormal. So they would compare the route against time. And but you notice what they did. They said he left the office at the regular time. He sometimes left early, and they give a goal statement to take care of home chores at his wife's request, okay? But not necessary. So they actually discounted an explanation for the regular, what could have been a different time, and then they explain the abnormal time. That he didn't drive home by his regular route, so he goes home by a different route, and he tells his friends at the office he's going to drive along the shore to enjoy the view. The day was exceptionally clear, all right? So he had reasons why he's going to do this. So one of the things they did, and this is interesting, because when you use abnormal circumstance or you have new information, you very often explain it. Okay? They committed the typical, and they were just following discourse rules, but it's a confound. So what I noticed that they did when I did this analysis is they confounded explanation with something unusual. So their claim was that people would use the route over the time because it's abnormal. And the confound is that this is explained in this story, but the time is not. Okay, time is discounted. Let me show you what the analysis looks like so you can see it. All right. When you analyze, this is the structure of that story in those categories that were marked there, but right through here, This is the main storyline. This is where he leaves the office, goes to the intersection, is killed. All right, that's the main storyline. And what they did, here's the time information. It's isolated because that particular information is explained, but it has no relationship to what he's doing. Okay? And they explained why he took the route he took here. So this would make this elaboration here of why he took the route he took to go home and all these reasons about enjoying the view would increase the connection strength here. All right? Whereas this information on time is isolated and gets some strength in our model. We built in some relationship based upon for isolated sentences, but this explanation here would not have any real effect. So I'll show you the time version to show you the difference. In the time version, what they did was, here they're explaining that he has to go do chores, so he's leaving the office early. And they explain that. His wife made a request, and so he has a goal, and he's going to carry it out, and that's that thing here. This is the route information about, they say sometimes he took the other route, but today it wasn't very nice, and so he didn't do it, and then that's isolated. So what happens in the time version, and this gets more strength, and this is now weakened. All right? Okay, so let me show you just quickly the data on that. The top graph are the data, and the bottom graph are the model.
The version means when he does leave to use
The time version would be when he leaves early, and the route version is when he takes the lakeshore, which
in
is
both cases he's killed.
he's always killed. Poor guy. I mean, he's always killed.
No matter what he
Oh yeah, and with me, I didn't show you something else. Okay, sorry about that. This is what they had to do. So they read the story, and they said, as commonly happens in such situations in the Jones family, their friends often thought and often said, if only. So they're actually forcing counterfactual. Okay. And how do they continue this thought, if only? So they give them all the alternatives. All right? And since they gave all the alternatives here, then the whole story is sort of activated. And I was going to look at the differential strengths of these and their explanations. So I took together the availability of not only that information, but also the information supporting it. Okay, that's what I'm going to show you. So people had to choose one of these alternatives, and I think they had to write about it, but this basically was which alternative gets chosen with what frequency. Okay, and they found that the unusual route was chosen in the route version, and the unusual time was chosen more than the usual. The unusual time was more than the usual route, which is what you anticipated. Okay, so here's the data. Here are the data. Sorry about that. All right, so here we have the route and time versions. And this is the proportion of people choosing it. So the abnormal route here versus the usual route, and then the usual time, and then the abnormal time. Okay? So here and then the model.
They are choosing which event, namely the causation event.
What did they choose to put into the counterfactual form?
Yes.
Okay. Right. And then the model gives you the very similar pattern of the data. So the simulation looks pretty good. Right? And then I did another thing where I created a decision rule where you can weight the alternatives. So it's like alternative A over A plus B plus C plus D. So a simple decision rule. And so here are these are the connection strengths of the antecedents of route and time and crossing and the boy. There are 4 alternatives. And then these are the predicted ratios of these connection strengths. And these are the observed. Now, that's not bad. It's not great, but it's not bad either. You do a pretty good job of what's the highest and do a fairly good job down here on these conditions. So I can predict the proportions of choices as well as the main 2 of route and time. Okay. Now, they did another thing in this study, which I'll share with you. They had a big elaboration of the boy. I don't know if you can see this, but I can read it to you. Okay, so they elaborated the boy. They went into great explanation. They said, it was later ascertained that the truck was driven by a teenage boy who was under the influence of drugs. His name was Tom Searler. His father found him at home. This was a common occurrence as he used drugs heavily. there was a quarrel, he grabs his keys and lying on the table, he drives off blindly and he was severely injured in the accident. Big elaboration about the boy as a driver, right? And remember, one of the 4 alternatives were boy, crossing, route, and time. Okay, so they get exactly what you might predict, but why do they get it? So the analysis of that is a big elaboration of the boy. So I've actually found 3 or 4 cases of elaboration now in the literature. So this is all the stuff about the boy. It's all interconnected, and it's used to explain his behavior of driving through the intersection at high speed, okay, and consequently killing him. Now, one of the effects I found of elaboration, it can do different things. It can either maintain something, or it can actually make something less available, or it can, 3 things. It can do all 3. It can either increase availability. In this case, it increases availability. I have cases where elaboration just simply maintains something. In other words, the connections are there, but they don't really add any strength. And I have a 3rd case that I found in the literature where they're elaborating where it's irrelevant. What was being talked about is totally irrelevant, and the stuff becomes less available. Okay? So this business of elaboration really depends upon connectivity. In this one, it was highly connected to the outcome, and the data show that very nicely. If you look at the 3 versions and connection strength. So here's the connection strengths here. Whoops, I didn't mean to put that off. Here's the connection strengths on the abscissa here. And on the ordinate, we got the percentage of people choosing those alternatives in the boy version. So what happens is route is...
Boy version means that that thing is only added, or is something...
You know, it's only the elaborated boy version, okay? And I now look at the connection strengths of things.
No, but I'm wondering, the rest, the previous story is still there.
The previous story is there. So you just add the ending. Just basically add the ending, and you get all more.
And then they blame the boy.
But look, yeah, so they choose the boy with very high probability, but also the connection strength has gone up relative to these 2 quite a bit, right? So again, the accessibility was a function of elaboration. In a chapter that I did using this model, I studied other cases of elaboration. I was just giving you a summary of those. So when you're telling a story and you digress, if your digression is really not on the main point, chances are your audience is going to lose a lot about what you were talking about. They're going to forget things and go off into trying to process this elaboration. On the other hand, if it's used to explain things, then it's going to make some difference. And there's some interesting findings on use of explanation for misinformation. For example, if you have misinformation in a context, the story context, then that misinformation will persist, but if you give an alternative and explain it, then it doesn't have the same effect. So there's various ways in which explanation can play a role in these memory representations, which this analysis begins to uncover. Okay, so as far as this Kahneman-Tversky study is concerned, then they confounded, they varied deviations from normality, normal versus unusual, but they explained the deviations. So they confounded explanation with usualness, and the model showed that the possibility, one possible alternative explanation is that the causes were more, those things which had causes as antecedents were more available, and that's what the data show. And what I've done is I've done 2 experiments in which I unconfound these things. And the way in which I did it was like that morning he took care of some chores. I mentioned he went to his doctor and he did some grocery shopping for his wife. And then later on in the story he leaves early. So there's no connection between doing those activities and his leaving early. Whereas in the explanation condition, the reason why he's leaving early is because he has chores to do and he's got to see his doctor. Okay? So I unconfounded that. And what we found is, in terms of the choices, when we experimentally remove this confound that they had, then you find these data here, which are the average rank. Okay, this is the rank here. Sorry about, I can get this up here. Maybe we can do it this way. Yes, okay, sorry. Okay, so this is the average rank here. And so this is normal, not explained. So it doesn't rank very high. Whereas the abnormal explained and normal explained rank higher in terms of choice. These differences here are not statistically reliable. There's a small trend, but it's not there. That would be the function of normal versus abnormal. These two together against these two are the function of explanation versus no explanation. So that shows empirically that when you unconfounded them, that it wasn't the abnormal thing that was driving their attention to those alternatives, but the explanations increase the likelihood that they would choose those alternatives. Okay, so my conclusions are fairly simple. First of all, I want to state, why was I successful? I mean, it's a combination of things. The success probably lies in the discourse analysis. That is, the kinds of relationships we identify in those causal analyses are crucial with respect to what gets fed into the model. But what the model does is quantify these in ways that you don't necessarily expect. And I have found time and again that I've been fooled by what the model outputs versus what my intuitions were. The only time you can really make a prediction is when there's a direct connection. You got a pretty good sense something's much more available. But if it's indirectly connected, you need to know what are all the other relationships. So basically, the success of this, it has to do then with having a connectionist model to quantify things. And I think that these connection strengths are strongly related to number of connections and also distance, causal distance in the network. So something is more accessible if it's closer together causally. In other words, you used it fairly recently to explain something else. And I have other data to support this from thinking aloud, where people go through a story and they try to understand each sentence, one sentence at a time, and they think aloud. And there you see lots of maintenance and carrying over of things which are things at a distance where are explaining things now are maintained or brought into memory and they're carried over. So that would support the availability argument. So I can't be sure which one it is, but what I use now this connectionist model for is hypothesis testing. In other words, I try out different assumptions about what's related, what's not related, and I can test it against data. So you can use it as hypothesis testing, which is a nice use of the model. And I think that it's consistent with this assumption that we track characters and we monitor their concerns and their states and what happens to them over space and time. And I think that it's also consistent with the idea of dynamic updating of representation. And and I think that these relationships that I'm calling causal are the ones that probably are operating here to index how you track characters. Oops, didn't mean to do that. And I had some conclusions which I took out about the other claims of these other people as hand-waving claims. That is, there is a need, I think, in this field to take seriously what your materials are, not to sort of say, this is what I'm bearing. One of the problems that experimental psychologists have is they think of one variable at a time. And something like a narrative, you have thousands of variables operating, many things operating together, and you really have to begin to sift those out. This causal analysis is just one measure on what might be going on. Obviously, lots of things are contributing to those inferences, which we don't identify. But a complete model hopefully would. But I think that the success we've had here and then elsewhere supports the idea of using this approach as a combination of both the narrative analysis, but also the simulation through some kind of quantitative analysis of these networks, so you can actually make predictions on the data. And we were quite successful. The chapter that I have has about 28 cases that I've dealt with in all kinds of variety of measures. And so those of you who are interested in this, I will send Ellen a copy of that chapter, and you can look at that since that's published. Okay, thanks. Peter. Yeah.
I have, how far do you want to push this, Tom? I have a suggestion. I'm just curious as to what do you suppose would happen if you applied these methods to looking at politicians answering questions? In other words, like, no, but seriously, like,
Oh, you have to have
people who get away without getting nailed on
Right.
these things.
Right.
Is it the case that, in fact, they're doing some of these sorts of things?
I think they are. I think I mean, I'm sure they use a lot of elaboration, which is irrelevant. So they, I mean, I haven't analyzed these, but one guess is they introduce a lot of irrelevant information. It's totally not on the question, and the idea is to make less available whatever it was,
Right.
what the question was, and whatever their answer is, right? Or they embed their answer in a lot of other detail, which makes it very difficult to ferret out and to make the connection you want to make. Yeah. So it's similar, but I think the relationships would not be necessarily causal. They would be attempts to, on their part, to know that they can make your memory for this quite bad, right? And they know how to do that, sure. So they're basically misleading you, and very often they do use a lot of elaboration. And very often they're answering a different question than one you asked. Nobody holds them responsible, right? Yeah.
This fits well with Grecian assumptions. The hearer is going to assume that what the speaker is saying is actually relevant.
Yes, that's correct.
And so you're
And I-
deliberately or not obscuring.
In that context.
Yeah, the actual.
So they wouldn't bother to analyze whether it's relevant or not. They wouldn't bother to do the analysis that it's relevant or not, which I would do if I were looking at the discourse, right?
Right.
I mean, it's like discovering, when I show this, when I've talked, I have a talk that I give only on that Kahneman and Tversky work, and I've done it with social psychology, people in psychology departments where they have a lot of social psychologists. And they don't, at first they don't get it. And then when they begin to look at it, they say, oh my God, you're right. You know, they did do this. But they don't, in other words, they don't analyze the text. They just basically read it over. Whatever claims are being made about the variable, they accept and they move on. Right? So that's where you're getting these unwarranted claims being made. Okay, so. Yeah, I agree with you. And also, another point you made me think of that I wanted to share with you. The narrator is choosing things to talk about. And whatever they put in to the narrative is typically relevant. And is the case. I mean, in the hundreds of narratives that I've analyzed, almost every clause has some relevance for something. And some become very important later on in the story and things of that sort. So there is a selection that goes on. And the way I would talk about it is that narrator selects conditions and then organizes them into the story. But most stories that we've looked at are explanation-based. In other words, a person's trying to understand something that happened to them or somebody else, and they're giving you a basis for your understanding of it and explaining it. All right? And it's especially true when people suffer negative events. So things like loss through death, or going through divorces, loss of an infant to SIDS syndrome. I've looked at all these kinds of things. I've also looked at Holocaust narratives and Holocaust diaries written by people who were living through the Holocaust. And I can analyze those quite well with respect to this analysis. But I also look at their evaluations of the thing. But what they're always doing is giving you enough information so you can empathize with them in the sense of monitor what their concerns or what's happened to them and feel something in return. So it's all relevant. It may not be relevant for the whole story, but it's relevant for some part. There are very few disconnected things. And in folk tales, everything that's in there is usually, they're very coherent. They're always in there quite tight. So when if I look at coherence as the overall connection strength of the whole story, and I look at a range of stories, I get a almost perfect correlation between connection strength for the whole story and coherence ratings. And that's because everything is really tied in quite nicely. And this is a very good analysis for coherence. Okay, yeah.
Does anyone use this kind of analysis to maybe improve narration skills?
Yeah, I think, well, there's some obvious ones. Like in the Kahneman and Tversky stories, the explanations come after the event. That's the worst thing you can do. If you want people, you really should keep the temporal causal sequence in order. So you're going to get some, there's lots of studies to show that when you invert cause and effect and have the causes coming after the effects, and even though you mark them, then it slows down processing a lot. because you have to go back and retrieve what it was you're trying to explain. Whereas you set up the conditions first and the person has those in mind, then the event comes in, it can be explained immediately. That's one easy thing. We can also identify coherence breaks. In other words, you're going along, everything's integrated, then there's a gap, and it's like an island, you know. In other words, the stuff doesn't relate to the next episode. I have stories I constructed like that, and there's a big slowdown right in the beginning of this new episode. There's no transition. So what explanations do is they really give you the reason to go from one episode to the next. Good teachers do that. Good teachers say, well, okay, we just completed this, now we're going to go ahead and we're going to use this in the next step, and then why we're going to do this next lesson, and so on. There's some discourse analysis on instruction that show those kinds of teachers bridge the gaps between various activities, and they give explanations to help make that bridge. And they show how what you just learned is useful for the next step. Same idea. So in stories you find the same thing. So it's very good for identifying breaks in coherence and where there's going to be some loss of comprehension because there isn't something to help sustain it and maintain the information.
This is one of the problems with Roger and Gail's story, though, the one that you showed us.
Yes.
Was to set up an expectation that she was going to get sick on the food.
That doesn't happen.
And it never comes
No.
back to that at
Yeah.
the end, right?
Right. No, in fact, they go off into this other thing about disco records or something.
Yeah.
So it's like irrelevant. I'm sure that threw everybody off a little bit. Yeah. There's a lot of... all the stories that I analyze, 3 stories that I analyze of theirs all have these gaps in them of that type, the type you're pointing out, but also they have gaps in terms of the units, and one of them you have to go back, you know, a lot, and that's going to cause lower connection strength and this backward inferencing past the point where you shouldn't have to do that. So they did some other things like that, and they confounded that as well. So, you know, if I want to do the right experiment, it's not worth it, but I could use it to clean up materials to overcome problems, but I can also use it as an explanation for some of the findings. Yeah. By the way, they had a big psych review paper where they criticized Art Gracer and Marie Singer and myself for being constructivist and all this stuff. I simulated all their data, so and all the claims they make in that psych review are wrong. So it's kind of fun. I'm writing a psych review paper now. I'm going to include all that. So that these various controversies in literature, you really begin to wonder what the basis for their claims are. And it's their intuitions that they translate into experiments, and then they think their findings have certain meaning, and it doesn't. So I analyzed every story they used, and I was able to predict all their data. So I feel pretty good now. And I'll feel more vindicated when it's public. I don't like doing that, but this was one case where we were really attacked by them. And so anyway, yeah, use the model that way. Any other questions?
Good. Well, thanks again.
Thanks. Thank you.